In the pitch-black night, over the central Atlantic sky, an airplane was flying at an altitude of 33 feet when it suddenly faced a critical situation. Running out of fuel midair, the pilot could only helplessly watch as the engines shut down one by one. Inside the cockpit, there was nothing but the vast ocean all around, not a single light. Desperation filled the air and quickly consumed the entire cockpit. In that life-or-death moment, all hope rested on the shoulders of the captain. What could he possibly do to save the precious lives of nearly 300 people sitting behind him? What caused the stable flying plane to suddenly run out of fuel over the ocean? Today, I'll tell you a true story about the miraculous survival of a flight with flight number 236 from Air Transat. On August 23, 2001, Pearson International Airport in Toronto, Canada was entering the evening flight rush hour. Amid that bustling atmosphere, an Airbus A330-200 had just finished refueling, preparing for a flight from Toronto to the capital, Lisbon, Portugal, covering a distance of approximately 3,945 miles. There were a total of 293 passengers on board. The man responsible for this flight was Captain Robert Piché, a highly experienced pilot. After completing his inspection around the aircraft, which had just had an engine replaced, he returned to the cockpit with the first officer to carry out the final preparations. Robert Piché was born on November 5, 1952. Since he was a teenager, he had been learning to fly airplanes and soon entered the aviation industry, thanks to frequently flying aircraft in harsh weather conditions across rural Quebec. He quickly developed solid flying skills. However, misfortune struck when the local airline he was working for fell into financial trouble and was forced to cut staff. Captain Piché lost his job, which meant losing his main source of income. During that tough time, under the influence of certain shady individuals, he once stepped onto the wrong path, flying aircraft to transport special plans from Jamaica to the U.S. just to make ends meet. On June 21, 1983, the Piper aircraft, piloted by Robert Piché, had just landed at an airport in Tattnall County, in the state of Georgia, USA, when police, who had been lying in wait, immediately stormed the plane. There, they found over 485 pounds of special plant material, a prohibited substance. As a result, Piché was sentenced to 15 years in prison for smuggling. However, due to good behavior, he was granted parole after just 18 months and returned to his hometown in Quebec, Canada, after quietly reintegrating into society. An unexpected opportunity came his way in 1995 when the airline, Air Transat, entered a rapid growth phase and was in dire need of experienced pilots. Despite his criminal record, the leadership at Air Transat still decided to give Piché a second chance. A man of great composure and seasoned experience served as a full-time pilot for the airline until 1999. Air Transat continued upgrading its fleet by introducing wide-body aircraft into service, namely the Airbus A330-200, one of the most advanced aircraft at the time, requiring only 2 pilots to operate. The A330 was fully capable of transatlantic flights on its own. Not wanting to miss a career opportunity, Piché quickly completed the transition training from the L-1011 TriStar to the A330-200 in the year 2000. That same year, he was officially appointed captain of the A330 fleet, a major turning point in his piloting career. Meanwhile, his companion on the fateful flight with flight number 236 was a young first officer, handsome and just 29 years old, but already had accumulated 4,800 flight hours, an impressive figure just a year before the incident. He had also completed training to transition to the A330 model, and since the beginning of his aviation career, he had maintained a flawless flight. At 8:52 p.m. local Toronto time on August 23, 2001, Air Transat Flight 236 took off, carrying 103,400 pounds of fuel. The weather was very favorable at the time. After passing over Lake Ontario, the aircraft quickly reached cruising altitude, which was 39,000 feet, equivalent to 11,887 meters. In the cockpit, the 2 pilots began to relax. After completing all the initial flight procedures, according to the schedule, 6 hours later, they would land at the airport in Lisbon, the capital of Portugal. Yet neither of them had any idea that a deadly danger was lurking right inside the aircraft's fuel system, which they were operating. Specifically, the fuel line of the right engine contained a hard-to-detect technical flaw, something that would change the fate of the flight entirely. Just 4 hours later, the root cause of this defect dated back to August 15th, exactly 1 week before the flight, when an Air Transat technician, during a routine inspection, discovered small metallic debris in the system of engine number 2's lubrication oil. Even though a follow-up inspection was done the next day, they continued to find more fragments, but were unable to determine their exact source or origin due to the discovery of abnormal metal debris in the oil lubrication system of engine number 2. With no clear Air Transat was forced to make the decision to replace the engine entirely to ensure flight safety. At that moment, Rolls-Royce, the engine manufacturer, happened to have a spare engine available, stored in a warehouse in Quebec. The engine, serial number 41.005, was promptly borrowed by Air Transat to replace the damaged engine. The replacement operation began at midnight on August 17th, with a tight completion deadline of 48 hours. An extremely urgent time frame for such a complex technical task. Throughout the process, the team of 5 engineers had to carry out a series of precise procedures, removing the old engine, prepping replacement components, installing the new engine, connecting all systems, and fitting accessories. And finally, with such a heavy workload and tight deadline, even a small mistake at any stage could have rendered the aircraft unable to complete the scheduled flight just 2 days later. As the saying goes, what you fear, you may face. The first issue occurred the very next day. During the installation of the hydraulic pump for the new engine, engineers discovered that the pump was installed in the older version, which was incompatible with the fuel line. On the current aircraft frame, the newer hydraulic had been removed from the previous engine, and when fitted onto the borrowed engine, it conflicted with the position of the fuel line and could not be properly aligned for installation. To find a solution, the engineers used 3 separate computers to access the internal network in order to look up the updated technical diagrams of the fuel line, but all of the servers mysteriously denied access, preventing them from reviewing the system structure. As time continued to pass quickly, the engine replacement process was seriously delayed. Faced with a deadlock situation, the engineering team had to accept a risky solution to slightly modify the fuel line structure in order to fit the older hydraulic pump. This proposal came from an engine expert and after careful consideration, the engineers decided to proceed. Afterward, the new engine was tested on site and showed no errors at all. However, since the replacement took place over the weekend, there were no quality control personnel present at the site, so the entire replacement process was accepted in a simplified manner, with no independent oversight. By Sunday evening, the job was finished. As the engineers wrapped up, feeling relieved, believing they had completed the task, but no one expected that this risky decision would become the very cause of an aviation disaster that almost happened later. A few days later, 4 hours into the flight, Air Transat Flight 236 was flying deep into the central Atlantic Ocean. While conducting routine checks on the technical readings in the control panel, the flight crew suddenly noticed something strange. The oil quantity in the right engine was significantly lower than that in the left engine. In addition, both oil temperature and pressure showed abnormal signs. Immediately, the 2 pilots consulted the flight manual to look for the cause, but found no description matching this unusual combination. They had to use high-frequency radio to contact ground maintenance support for help. However, after analysis, the ground engineers were also unable to identify the specific cause behind the anomaly. After a round of discussion, the 2 pilots came to the hypothesis that, since all the other engine performance indicators were within normal limits, the 3 abnormal oil parameters might be caused by faulty sensors, but they were wrong. In reality, these abnormal signals were actually the direct result of a fuel leak in the right engine during the earlier replacement. Although the engineer had tried to maintain a safe distance between the hydraulic pump, which was incompatible, and the fuel line, he failed to anticipate one issue. The flexible hydraulic line would deform under high pressure during operation. This deformation caused the 2 lines that initially didn't touch to come into direct contact. As a result, high-frequency vibration from the engine fatigued and cracked the fuel line, producing an L-shaped crack 3.15 inches long and 0.1 inch wide, enough to let fuel leak out rapidly without immediate detection. In reality, fuel in the right tank had already begun leaking for at least 30 minutes before the flight crew noticed the anomaly. But why was there no imbalance warning between the two fuel tanks? The reason lay in the unique structure of the Airbus A330 aircraft. To maintain a stable center of gravity in flight, the aircraft is equipped with a trim fuel tank located in the rear horizontal stabilizer. This system automatically transfers fuel from the rear tank to the forward tanks. When it detects a center of gravity shift, the reserve fuel in the trim tank had silently compensated. Ba luong min lu dang 7 thot o thung ben phi. Keen kak chi so hien ti trin bang ju keen. Van Due Tri Trang Tai Kan Dan Lua Tabe, They In Hung Ju Du Kong the Kio Dai Mai. Veo 533 Theo Geo Foi Hop Quoc Tutc. Ton Bo Nien Lu Trong Thung Kan Bang Da By Rut Can. Nai Luke Du Bang Ju Keen Lap Tuc Fat Thong Bao. Kan Bao Dao Tien. Tu Fight Song Jiat Min Kai. Thay Thung Nien Lu Ben Phi. Chikan at Han Ben Tre Toi 3T. Mot Dao Hu Ro Rong Cho Thay Tin Trang Ro Ri. Niam Trong Dang Dien Ra. And Hung Kai Adaquam Yuan. Juamon Dem Tin Lang Qua Dai Tajium. 306 Con Nuoi Tren Koang. Trong Du Ko Ca Tre M Dang Bay O Du Chao Ten M. Bat Ingio Roy Veo Tin Kan Gat Geo. Cheek Mai Bay Kong Lo Dang Lao Dan. Veo Trang Tai Mat Nong Luong Hon Tone. Tien Gon Bo Vuk Tam Qua Mot Tam Hoa Hong. Kong Kong the Luong Truok. De Suel Y Tin Trang Mat Kan Bang Nien Lu Bat Thuong. Debate Quiet Din Mo Van Trian Nien Lu. Tap Bomb Nien Lu Qua Thung Ben Phi. Dong Doi Thiat Lap, Lai He Thong. The Dan Nien Lu Tu Thung Ben Tre. Sang Ben Phi. Tai Nien. Hoda Kong Luong Truok Duok Rang Han Dong Nai. Se Keen Su Vik Toi Ti Han. Theo So Te Hung Dan Ky Thuit Qua 330. Trong Truong Hop. Gi Ngio Ko Ro Ri Nien Lu. Phi. Song Kong Duok Phep Chien Nien. Nam Tran Lam 7 Thot Them Luong Nien Lu Con Lai. And Hung Veo Thoi Diem Du. Tabe Van Tin Rang Su Chin Lek Trong Du. Lula Du Cam Bien Bao Sai. And not due to an actual malfunction. Moreover, the version of the flight manual used at that time contained no advisory instructing pilots to consider a potential fuel leak upon detecting an imbalance. As a result, Captain Robert Piché did not consider this dangerous scenario. Based on post-incident analysis, it was determined that, prior to opening the fuel cross-feed valve, only the right fuel tank had a leak. But once the tanks were connected, fuel from the left tank was also drawn over and continued to leak through the same cracked pipe. This unintentional action resulted in both fuel tanks being completely drained. Even though the A330 at that time was one of the most advanced aircraft, its warning system still did not provide any clear signal indicating a fuel leak. To verify the situation, Captain Piché asked the cabin crew to perform a visual check through the passenger windows in order to observe whether any fuel was leaking from the aircraft's wings. However, since the flight took place at night, visibility was extremely limited, and there was no light reflecting off the fuel, which was leaking inside the engine area. This made visual confirmation virtually impossible when the crew received the report from the flight attendants that nothing unusual was observed. First Officer de Jaeger suggested activating the fuel leak response procedure, as per the manual, which meant shutting down the suspected leaking engine and descending to 20,000 feet, approximate 6,000 meters. At that moment, however, Captain Piché still couldn't determine exactly where the fuel was leaking from, and he assessed that if a leak was actually occurring, executing that procedure wouldn't stop the fuel from continuing to leak anyway. More importantly, descending to a lower altitude would eliminate the advantage of glide distance in the event the engines completely shut down later, which would be extremely dangerous if an emergency landing were needed over the vast Atlantic Ocean. Psychologically speaking, humans tend to believe in outcomes that are favorable to them and avoid imagining negative scenarios. From the beginning, Captain Piché believed the sensors were faulty and that it was merely a computational glitch in the system. Given the context at the time, a major fuel leak incident was considered extremely rare, so he didn't immediately carry out the procedure, as recommended. From a behavioral psychology perspective, Piché's decision not to act immediately was influenced by cognitive bias, where people cling to their initial beliefs and ignore counterintuitive signs. Ultimately, just 10 minutes after opening the fuel crossfeed valve, the control panel displayed a new alert. The total remaining fuel on board had dropped to a critical level, as all efforts to control the fuel loss produced no clear results. The flight crew realized they no longer had enough fuel to continue flying to Lisbon. Faced with this emergency, they had only one choice left: over the Atlantic Ocean, request diversion to Lodges Airport in the Azores Islands, the nearest location for an immediate emergency landing. The crew sent a radio transmission to the Santa Maria Area Control Center, requesting an emergency diversion to Lodges to limit further fuel loss. Captain Piché made a tactical decision to turn on the right fuel pump and shut off the left, causing fuel from the right tank to transfer to the left, thus avoiding further transfer from the left tank into the possibly leaking right tank. Time passed to 5:59 UTC, and the total fuel remaining was only about 9,260 pounds, approximate 4.2 metric tons. However, from Air Transat headquarters, engineers presented a different hypothesis, that the left fuel tank might actually be the one leaking. Following ground advice, the captain turned off the right fuel pump again. Unfortunately, this decision, based on an incorrect assumption, only made the situation worse. As the aircraft's fuel continued to drain rapidly, the flight computers began issuing warnings that fuel levels were critically low and an immediate landing was required. However, the crew still couldn't determine exactly which tank was leaking and had no choice but to activate all fuel pumps at once to maintain system pressure. Shortly after that, only 1,367 pounds of fuel remained in the left tank. The right engine officially shut down to prolong altitude hold time. Captain Piché pushed the left engine to maximum continuous power, but the aircraft couldn't hold on for much longer. It began descending from 39,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean, drifting downward toward the sea as the clock hit 6:26, where dawn began to break on the horizon. But in the cockpit known as the most beautiful office in the world, there was no room for romantic moments. Captain Piché and First Officer de Jager focused intensely on the instrument panel. As the numbers dropped to zero, the left engine also officially ran out of its last drop of fuel. Finally, Flight 236 was still 75 miles away from Lodges Airport and had lost all engine thrust. From that moment, Captain Piché was no longer just flying a machine weighing over 220,000 pounds, gliding midair. He had to ensure it could stay on the right far enough to reach the runway and still have hope. The situation became more dire as flight control systems, electric flaps, pressurization, reverse thrust, and braking, which all depended on engine power, were severely compromised in that moment. Captain Piché's left hand not only gripped the control column tightly, but also held the lives of all 306 souls on board. Despite having over 16,000 flight hours, he had never before had to glide a wide-body aircraft of this size under such conditions, with both engines completely shut down. In this dire situation, energy management became critical. Captain Piché chose to reduce airspeed during the initial gliding phase to gradually lose altitude, trying to maintain enough height when approaching the airport in order to make a final course correction. Behind the cockpit, 293 passengers, under the guidance of flight attendants, mentally prepared themselves for the scenario of an emergency water landing. In the dark cabin, they wore oxygen masks and looked out the windows as the first light of day slowly illuminated the wings. But in that silence, fear began to quietly awaken, a fear tapping steadily on the edge between life and death. The aircraft continued gliding silently in the sky. No engine sound, only the eerie howling of wind resistance, echoing through the vast Atlantic sky. 5 minutes after both engines had failed, Air Transat Flight 236, under air traffic controller guidance, approached runway 33, about 8 nautical miles, 9.2 miles, away. At that moment, the the plane descended to around 13,000 feet, still quite high for a normal landing approach, compared to standard landing conditions. However, for a plane with no engine power, this was actually good news. At least they had enough altitude to keep gliding and actively adjust their descent path to maintain direct visual contact with the runway. Captain Piché decided to make a wide left turn, a large circle to bleed off excess altitude. During the turning glide, the crew deployed the landing gear, a technique to help the plane lose altitude faster. However, after that wide turn, Piché realized the plane was still too high and too fast. He couldn't just push the nose down, because that would cause the aircraft to accelerate dangerously on approach. With only one chance to land successfully, Piché applied a snake-like gliding maneuver, guiding the aircraft in a zigzag path to effectively bleed off the remaining altitude. Passengers under the wings swayed left and right, as if riding an airborne roller coaster. Inside the cabin, silence reigned. Only the whistle of the wind remained as the aircraft neared the runway at a speed of 220 knots, over 250 miles per hour, about 75 knots faster than the standard landing speed. They knew if this landing failed, all their efforts would be for nothing. 6:45, Flight 236, after gliding 75 miles with no engine power, officially touched down on Lodge's runway. Due to the excessive speed, the aircraft slid over 2,600 feet before making full contact with the ground. The captain immediately applied the brakes, but the anti-lock braking system was disabled due to lack of engine. The plane began veering side to side, and the remaining braking pressure was only enough for one stop. Finally, though the landing gears suffered major damage, the A330 came to a complete stop just 2,400 feet from the end of the runway. A miracle had just happened. 306 lives on board, 293 passengers, and 13 crew members, all safe. They were immediately evacuated through emergency inflatable slides. The subsequent investigation confirmed a cracked fuel line was the primary cause. The engineer who replaced the engine did not replace the compatible hydraulic pipe, leading to contact and vibration, which caused the fuel line to crack. According to the investigation team's conclusion, if the crew had detected the leak early on and not activated the fuel transfer system, the plane would have had enough fuel to land safely at the Azores, with both engines still functioning normally. However, at that time, neither Captain Piché, First Officer de Jager, nor most other A330 pilots had received specialized training on how to detect and handle fuel leaks. By recognizing imbalance indicators, this lack of training and procedural guidance was an indirect factor that prevented the crew from taking early action. Yet Captain Piché's exceptional flying skills saved everyone aboard that day. He and First Officer de Jager were honored by the International Pilots Association with the Award for Outstanding Airmanship, a prestigious recognition for courage, composure, and flawlessly precise flying skills. After this incident, aircraft manufacturer Airbus updated operational procedures to help pilots more easily detect signs of fuel leakage. More clearly, airlines around the world also enhanced training programs on fuel emergency handling for pilots. Captain Robert Piché still holds the world record for the longest unpowered glide by a commercial jet, 75 miles. And to this day, that remains a record no one ever hopes to break at the end of this story. But I only hope that no one else will ever have to face what Captain Piché did. Yet if it happens again, may they have the same strength and a steel heart like he once had.